to hear of was geographical gains of towns and territory on a large scale and large bags of prisoners. And that a successful fight that only involved an advance of a couple of thousand yards and the slaughter of a large number of Germans did not appeal to them. They wanted something tangible. And in some ways he's saying that, yeah, they think war should be conducted as Binding thought it should be conducted, and not as it was taking place. But this is a British Prime Minister stating matter-of-factly the strategic principle of this war, the slaughter of a large number of Germans, the central principle of attrition broadly stated. The problem with this is that it involves a reciprocal sacrifice, often as great, sometimes greater, of a similar number of Englishmen and Frenchmen, and indeed any other army that choose to take on the very tactically effective German army of the first half of the First World War. And at some point during the conflict, whether it was 1914, maybe 1916, maybe later in the 1920s, the sacrifice itself became a slaughter in its own right. And maybe simply because this takes place in a narrow strip of land in northern France, essentially, a few thousand muddy yards of contested trenches. Lloyd George, who was always anti-attrition as the war went on, certainly skewed perspectives thereafter in his war memoirs, in which he wrote, "A war of attrition was substituted for a war of intelligence." Not that he ever satisfactorily defined what a war of intelligence actually could have been or should have been in its place. So they knew they were fighting a war of attrition. But as we come to look at it 100 years later, how can we, as it were, get beyond the sort of the nitty-gritty of what's going on to actually get a big picture, a characterization that will help us understand the features. We tend, of course, to characterize the First World War in terms of its geographic fronts. We've got the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Italian or Southern Front, and subsidiary fronts in the Middle East, Salonika, the Dardanelles, etc. We are hung up on these territorial ideas that Asquith is critical of in 1916. I think we need to think about it slightly differently, as a war being conducted on 5 separate but interlinked fronts. Activity on these, not just military, would determine collectively the outcome of the war. The land fronts collectively are the first front, as it were. This is the main front, the focal point on which military strategy is predicated, of which the allocation of resources is determined. The expectation that singly or collectively this will be where the war is decided. These are backed by a second front, a maritime front, of both naval and merchant marine activity. Behind these is the third, or the home front, an industrial and economic effort. Fourthly, there's a diplomatic front. Firstly, engaged with expanding the war, and latterly engaged with war aims and peace diplomacy, and to a certain degree with propaganda. Finally, there's what I would define as a united front. These are 2 coalitions at war. You have to maintain the cohesion of your alliance in a prolonged conflict. And the other facet of that is actually undermining the cohesion of the enemy's alliance as well. And if you're operating strategy on these 5 fronts, it's going to be complicated. It's going to be difficult. Errors are inevitably going to be made in places. I think 2 of these fronts in particular, the land front and the home front, are the decisive fronts for this war. They work closely in symbiosis. In some ways, the central issues of strategy is, can the army win the war before the people's resolve collapses? Or on the other hand, can the war effort provide the necessary resources, guns, munitions, for the army actually to win the war on the battlefield? And I think the purpose of the other 3 is essentially to service and to influence activities on those two key fronts. And in order to decide this war, you need victory on all 5 fronts. How do you achieve victory on all 5 fronts? 3 factors, I think, are in play. Firstly, the factor of mobilisation of your own and of your allies' resources. Men, industrial financial capacity, and what I call the hearts and minds, the commitment of the people to the war. These are elements of grand strategy. Secondly, your actual military strategy is geared to attacking and destroying your adversary's resources. Manpower is key, central in a war of attrition, of course, but also material, productive capacity, economic stability, morale, we shouldn't forget, their willingness to continue the war militarily and socially. In some ways, this is the area of operations, how the war is actually conducted. Tactics themselves, although a lot of attention is lavished on them, is not decisive in themselves. It's the operational level of war that's going to determine the outcome of how the war proceeds and who wins in the end. Your third factor is one of resilience. You've got to be able to absorb the enemy's blows. You've got to be able to adapt to the changing fortunes of war. And this is quite understood at the time, I think. I'm going to quote from a not very often read publication these days, the Vivid War Weekly. But probably very well read by the British public in February 1915, when a British officer, not identified, explained to them under the title, "What a War of Attrition Means." And his readers would have read, "This is a war of attrition. Attrition in the trenches, in the home, in the markets, in the workshops, in the counting houses and stock exchanges. There's no elbow room for manoeuvre. It's just a matter of slaughter and maiming and sickness for months and months, until at last the combatant men are thinned down to a lesser density. The nation faced a trial of endurance. It is the nation and not merely the army which has to face the music." This would not possibly have surprised anyone listening to Churchill in World War II. We tend to forget exactly the same approach was taken by Britain to World War I. It's the blood, sweat and tears of taking on and beating Germany. The centre of gravity, to use a Clausewitzian term, of this war becomes the enemy's manpower reserves. The enemy's ability to keep his armies in the field up to strength. And this operates on all levels of war. At the tactical level, on the battlefield, you have to engage and you have to defeat the enemy's local reserves, those troops that he can put into battle to fight for the trenches. Small formations, companies, battalions. Trench warfare actually makes this more difficult. If you're dug in, you can actually economise on the men who are holding the trenches and use machine guns and artillery to control and fight for ground. This is the essential factor why warfare is so gritty, so difficult, so prolonged, attritional, for want of a better word. The solution to this is better tactical doctrines, but also an increase in firepower that allows you to operate on these battlefields. I don't want to go into complicated military history, but the French sum it up nicely in 1915. The artillery conquers, the infantry occupies. Basically, this is what all armies are learning to do as the war goes on. In fact, they actually learn to do it much earlier than you think, by 15, early 16, but they still got to do it, as it were, to complete the sort of the cycle, the equation of attrition before the war will come to an end. At the next level of war, the operational level, the objective of attrition is the reserves that are not in the front line, divisions, army corps, units that can be brought in and reinforce threatened sectors of the front when the enemy is mounting an offensive. This is why you get the long, costly battles we associate with the First World War. Very much an attempt to engage and wear down operational reserves and overstretch the enemy by coordinating offensive operations on all fronts. These are the essential principles of strategy by General Joseph Joffre, who was the essentially French commander and Allied commander-in-chief for the first half of the war, who inaugurated the War of Attrition. At the strategic level, you still have a problem that each year the army can reinforce, replace losses in the ranks by younger men normally, and later older men who have not yet, as it were, been put in uniform, trained and committed to the war. So strategically, you have to engage and defeat the manpower reserves that are held on the home front. The more intensive your warfare, the more rapidly the enemy would have to bring in these reserves, the more rapidly you would get through his strategic manpower reserves. As the war goes on, it's clear that all armies have to call up and deploy annual manpower contingents more rapidly than would have been expected in the peacetime cycle. These reserves are being worn out. But it's not going to be a quick and efficient process by any means. The first thing that actual general staffs do over the winter of 1914-15, when the war stalemates, is actually sit down, add up the manpower on both sides and try to work out how long it will take to eliminate the enemy's army in the field. I quote from the Assistant Chief of Operations at the War Office. Lord Kitchener displayed some interest in these mathematical exercises and was not wholly unimpressed when figures established the gratifying fact that the German legions were a vanishing proposition. Essentially, Kitchener recognised that this was the guiding principle of how to decide the war. The problem is, at this point, it was impossible to assess how long it would be until these German legions vanished. These were very imprecise and over-optimistic calculations at the beginning of 1915. Some people said it would take 6 months. They were very wrong. But as the war goes on, this will become an annual and a more sophisticated exercise. You can't wear out the enemy unless you actually know how many of the enemy there are to wear out. You can't manage your own war effort unless you know how many men and women you have and you are able to allocate them appropriately to the home front or the military forces as appropriate. And in this respect it becomes a statistician's war, a war of counting and accounting of men, resources, impact of the naval blockade, etc., etc. Sensible calculations in 1915 would have shown that all states had the capacity to actually keep expanding their armies in the first 2 years of the war, despite the impact of attrition. Operation Attrition, therefore, doesn't really get underway till late 1916, 1917. It was Kitchener, British Secretary of State for War, who created Britain's new armies, who actually said, when asked when will the war end, I don't know, but I know it won't begin until the middle of 1916, when Britain's armies are ready to take the field. He did appreciate that these forces were raised as a make-weight, as it were, in the balance of manpower, the balance of attrition. Joffre, the French army commander, took the same approach. He rationalises this, in fact, in his memoirs after the war, although possibly he wasn't as efficient in the process as he liked to think he was. The French army fought some very bloody battles with relatively limited effect in 1915 before they started to get the methods on the battlefield right from 1916 onwards. The problem with this is it meant that by 1916 French manpower is becoming short. But the French have learned the principle that you can substitute on the battlefield material for manpower. In some ways the mobilisation of the home front allows you to produce more guns and shells and that takes the pressure off the armies, the land fronts and land warfare to a certain extent when it comes to engaging with and wearing out the enemy's reserves. They could have probably done without damaging their armies so much in 1914 and 1915. After 1916, they became more reliant on imperial levies and their allies to take a greater share of the fighting from Germany. But the other issue with this is, of course, even if the French had waited till they're properly equipped, there would still be the same German army in front of them that had to be taken on and beaten, and that army in its turn would have had time to expand and equip. So that the task was still the same whenever you started it and however efficiently you carried it out. I think Joffre's presentation to French politicians in November 1916 is probably the most measured exposition of attrition. It suggested that his policy, although tough, was working. In his memoirs he summarises the numbers game and suggests that the Allies have a superiority of 2,200 battalions, and this is now the time to destroy the enemy's defensive capacity, having paralysed his offensive power in the 1916 campaign. 1916's effective strategic principle that Joffre had championed and forced through was to attack together and on all fronts. We dwell on the Battle of the Somme. I've written on the Battle of the Somme, but the Battle of the Somme is just one component of a much broader strategic scheme, the General Allied Offensive, which involved battles at Verdun, the Russian army on the Eastern Front of the Brutal Offensive, and the Italian army on the Southern Front against the Austrians. The objective of 1916's war, or campaign, simply put, agreed by the Allies in December 1915, was the destruction of the German and Austrian armies, a purely attritional objective. Politicians were rather unhappy with Verdun and the Somme. They sacked Joffre at the end of 1916, just when I think if they'd backed him, he might have actually carried on this strategy effectively and decided the war a year earlier than it actually ended. Certainly, analysis of the German army indicates that it's in the grip of a manpower crisis from the end of 1916 that only gets worse through 1917 and 1918. There's a certain reprieve when Russia drops out and German forces can be moved from east to west, but from this point onwards, particularly with American manpower coming into the balance on the Allied side, Germany is never going to win the war of numbers in this respect. By 1918, you can see the Allied military statisticians not simply counting the enemy's men, how many they've got left, they're actually doing it in such a sophisticated way that they tick off the German divisions one by one as they are beaten on the battlefield, and they can assess the cumulative impact of attrition on the enemy's army. It's become a mathematical exercise, and interestingly, the last set of figures that the French intelligence staff compiled on Armistice Day, November 1918, indicates that Germany only has 2 fresh reserve divisions left. The war comes to an end because the process of military attrition has been completed. This is not an easy process. The land war is determined by one side developing the ability to inflict casualties, losses on the enemy at a rate that their reserves could not replace. It does, as I put it that way, sound cruel and callous, but I'm afraid basically that's the principle of warfare from time immemorial. This has been contentious. Winston Churchill, in his memoirs, wrote a strong critique of what he called the blood test, the process of attrition. Essentially, he's referring to the first half of the war and the mistakes that Joffre made in 1914 and 15. On a man-for-man basis, yes, the German army had a strong advantage on the battlefield in the first 2 years of the war. A French historian has actually come up with some statistics. And he's indicated that in their early battles, the Germans were inflicting losses man for man of 1.88 and 2.22 casualties for each casualty they suffered on the French and the British armies in the early campaigns. But significantly, when it comes to the last campaigns in November 1918, those figures are on a par, 1.15 and 1 to 1, which is indicative that the process of attrition, the tactical and operational methods have adapted to achieve the operational and strategic objectives of the armies in the field. This does, of course, cost many lives in the process. We have to see, I think, this as a consequence of the nature of the war itself as much as any particular fault of military leadership, which is often what it's attributed to. This was a war that would be fought and decided on land. British statesmen often thought otherwise. In a famous memorandum in December 1914, Churchill expressed his belief, now that stalemate has set in on the Western Front, that the military mobility resulting from sea power, applicable over a large area, will counterbalance to a great extent the enemy's advantage of interior lines. It was soon proved that this strategic principle no longer held good in the age of mass warfare. Churchill tried at Gallipoli, which turned into another stalemated attritional campaign against reserves the Turkish army could deploy to contain the Allied landings. Same happened when they tried to push through the Balkans by landing at Salonika later in 1915. So sea power does not give you strategic flexibility. In that case, what use is sea power? Well, the maritime front itself is not in itself decisive, but it certainly underpins what you can do on the other fronts. It gives you strategic flexibility. It gives you strategic reach. And in this, the Allies begin the war and retain a huge advantage. The sea war is not a war of fleet actions. It's a war of blockade and of counter-blockade. Essentially the attrition of the carrying capacity and the economic capability of the rival alliance. It's a war of submarines, U-boats, unrestricted submarine warfare by the Germans, anti-submarine warfare by the Allies. War of mines and minesweepers. A war of infraction of the laws of the sea and the impounding of cargoes. And the blockade campaign, essentially, it's also a diplomatic as well as a maritime campaign. It involves engagement with neutrals and control of the global economy and world trade. Ironically, perhaps, only at sea the Allies might have been beaten. As a maritime alliance, their war efforts and their military campaigns were much more reliant on sea communications than those of the landlocked Central Powers. La guerre, c'est la shipping is a famous, wonderful Franglais quote from a French Minister of Shipping, Minister of Commerce rather, towards the end of the war. Without keeping the sea lanes open, the Allies would have great difficulty in sustaining their armed forces and keeping up the grip they had Germany in and exerting the pressure needed to decide the war. Maybe if Germany had stuck to unrestricted submarine warfare from 1915 when she began it, she might have had a better chance. Maybe not. It worried the Allies greatly, but possibly Germany never really had enough submarines to make this campaign effective, similar to the situation in World War II. On the home front, you see a modern war effort, equivalent to that we are more familiar with from the Second World War. It can be asked to what extent was mobilisation on the home front actually the bedrock of victory? Well, certainly appropriate weapons in necessary amounts, in fact in huge amounts, underpin the success and failure of military tactics and operations in the field. Communications technologies allow the whole thing to work. So it becomes a war of industry, a war of science, of technology, a war of invention. It will mobilise civil societies. Universities university academics would have had their place in the war effort like everybody else. The central government was the agency for mobilisation of societal resources. In fact, the government was an agency, but mobilisation essentially took place independent of much government initiative at the start of the war. It's a process of self-mobilisation that begins. It's not really till, in this country certainly, mid-1915, the government is having to take a greater control of the war effort, and legislation starts to be enacted to actually steer what society is doing in the right direction and get a balance between the various economic and social and military components of the war effort as it's maturing. The other thing you have to do is to sustain popular will behind the war effort, the so-called will to victory. Societies are divided either by issues of class or of nationality before 1914. You can start the war by demonising the enemy, saying this is the reason why we are fighting them and they deserve to be fought and beaten. But later on you've got to adapt a bit. You've got to give your people ideas, ideals worth fighting for. You've got to sustain a will to victory when war weariness starts to set in. You can attack the home front indirectly by blockade. You could attempt to starve out the enemy. A hungry enemy is a demoralised one. You're even starting to attack it directly by air power, zeppelins, etc. In a limited form in World War I, because a frightened enemy is also a weakened one. These two are both slow-working attritional weapons, and they are not ultimately decisive in the war. Next, there's the diplomatic front. In some ways, the diplomatic war has two phases. Phase one, you need to expand the war. Phase two, you need to justify the war to neutrals. I suppose the third phase starts to be, you have to consider and prepare for the coming peace, whatever form that might take. Will it be a peace of exhaustion, or will it be a negotiated peace with advantage? Much discussion of this, certainly from 1916 onwards, but difficult, as it were, to identify and pin down the form the peace is going to take. In some ways, the first phase of expanding the war is a tie. The Germans bring in the Turkish Empire on their side in November 1914, and towards the end of 15, Bulgaria joins them. The Allies bring in the Italians in 1915, but they don't have much success in trying to win over other Balkan states. Thereafter, all the success is on the Allied side. Although some states, like Romania, that comes in September 1916 to make an old-fashioned imperialist land grab, rather miscalculates, doesn't know what she's getting herself into, and is quickly beaten militarily by Germany. American entry, followed by many other neutrals from 1917, certainly indicates the way the diplomatic war has gone. That's been won by the Allies by 1917. They've secured the diplomatic and moral high ground, so they're successful. From 1916, particularly with the impetus behind it of the United States, which had desired to play the role of mediator as well as in the European war. War aims and diplomacy, peace diplomacy, become a growing aspect of the diplomatic front. Are you going to have an imperialistic peace? Are you going to have an American peace? Are you going to have an international socialist peace? A peace without territorial annexations or financial indemnities, as socialists start to promote, and certain statesmen, Kerensky in Russia, for example, start to adopt as their broad agenda. Finally, There's the United Front. How are we doing for time? This is a coalition war for both sides. Success is concomitant on an alliance's cohesion and military effectiveness. Germany adopts an attritional strategy of her own, in fact, designed to try to break the alliance ranged against her. They take their model from Frederick the Great's conduct of the 7 Years' War, in fact. But the more Germany strikes at the individual allies, she strikes at Russia in 1915, France in 1916, Italy in 1917, actually Britain in 1917 before Italy. The more she does this, contrarily, the more the allies pull together. In September 1914, they make a pact not to sign a separate peace. By the end of 1917, they've actually come together in a Supreme War Council, a sort of a joint economic, diplomatic war effort, which is certainly going to strengthen their ability to conduct the war. So the Entente evolves from a pre-war diplomatic alliance to essentially a strategic partnership with a common war effort, a precursor to that we're going to see between Britain and America in World War II. The working of the administrative and commercial machinery here is significant. It allows the Entente to make more effective war on the maritime and home fronts. Ultimately, the appointment of General Ferdinand Foch as Allied Generalissimo in 1918 allows the best coordination yet on the land front as well. In some ways, the Allies develop a mature coalition, whereas the Germans keep a coalition in which Germany is the dominant partner, and basically it's an authoritarian structure and does not work as well. Come 1917-18, Germany is holding her allies who don't no longer be fighting into her alliance, rather than, as it were, bringing them along with a shared set of objectives and war aims. And interestingly, as the land campaigns had shown, although Germany could beat individual Entente or Allied states, defeat them and occupy them, Belgium in 1914, Serbia in 1915, Romania in 1916, even Russia when it collapses in 1917, it doesn't knock these states out of the war. They stay belligerent until they have an opportunity to have their say in a peace conference. So the idea, as Lloyd George put forward, that knocking away the props from Germany, beating Bulgaria and Turkey would decide the war, was fundamentally false on the evidence of what actually happened when states were defeated on the battlefield the other way around. The French army had an adage, dates from 1915. All these things are but incidents, and will have no effect on the final result. A nation is not defeated while its army is still standing up in its boots, so it is folly to bother over details. Interestingly, when the enemy alliance, the Central Powers, does collapse, they collapse all at the same time, like a house of cards, because the Entente, the Allies, have won on all 5 fronts by this point. To conclude, I hope the simplicity of the strategy of this war has come out. You simply need to outproduce, to outlast, and to outfight your enemies. This is a tough thing to do. Germany tried it and failed. The Allies succeeded. They won on all 5 fronts. Although it's victory on the land front, the defeat of the German army, that is going to demonstrate that you have done this. Interestingly, all the other Central Powers armies were defeated at roughly the same time. There's a sustained military perception during the war that the decisive point is the German army on the Western Front. And in some ways that is the climactic moment of the war. If Germany had gone first, I doubt that Bulgaria, Turkey would have fought long. Lloyd George complained to the War Council in November 1916, "What is our policy? Has anyone mapped out a road to victory? I've only heard of one. People talk of hammering and of war of attrition. The success of hammering depends entirely upon whether you are making a greater impression on the barrier or the hammer. The success of war of attrition depends on the time it takes and who can last out the longest. Lloyd George was right about that, but he was very impatient. He was unrealistic as to what was possible in a war with mass mobilisation on both sides. He believed the Allied hammer was suffering more damage than the German anvil, and that was simply not the case. The Allies had won on all except the land fronts by 1917, and they were gearing up to give the coup de grace to Germany on that front too, when the opportunity came, if not in 1918, then in 1919 or in 1920. I think Allied strategic leaders had appreciated the nature of war and strategy from the start, particularly General Joffre and Field Marshal Kitchener. They developed appropriate methods of attritional battle to win on the land front. They mobilised intensively to win on the home front, and they had the advantage of a greater population and resource base to begin with. They also had deeper pockets, particularly because they had the Americans' money and industrial capacity behind them from the start. They had a stronger will to victory based on democratic values, which are strong enough to cope with the short-term knocks that you would get in a war, things like French army mutinies in 1917, the German Spring Offensive in March 1918. On the maritime front, they had open access to the oceans and global trade, over which they always maintained control, facilitating success on the land and home fronts. They were much more skilled diplomatically. They held the moral high ground, and they had better diplomatic sense. They were much more adaptable on the united front to the needs of coalition warfare. They accepted from the start the need to hang together or hang separately. The Central Powers ultimately would hang separately. They collapsed and each made a separate peace in the end. To conclude, I think 4 years to reach a decision in a war like this is actually remarkable in the circumstances. I hope you're persuaded that it's due to a thought out and sustained strategy of attrition after stalemate set in at the end of 1914. Thank you.
Thank you very much.